Hi, Katrina. It's so good to see you. I'm so excited to talk about your book, Invoking the Spirits, the Occult Influence in Ezra Pound's Pisan Cantos.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So you have to tell me, how did you get into this topic?
Well, I think as most academics have a story, I was taking a graduate level course at Clemson University. That's where I got my master's degree. And then there was this class on Intro to Modernism, and it was everything from literature to poetry, the whole nine yards, right? A little bit of art thrown in. And I loved it. I'd never studied or come across modernists like that era before, and I was fascinated. But in the class, we had this little book, and it was the Pisan Cantos by Ezra Pound. And my professor introduced it as, well, this is an interesting work, and it might be difficult to understand, but it's open to interpretation. I was like, cool, that's different, versus things that we've all read, like Ulysses or what have you, lots of Yeats. Um, so I did a deep dive into it, and I decided that's what I wanted to write my thesis on. And it's such an open-ended work, and it's open to interpretation, which I like because I feel though, and we might talk about some of these themes of exclusivity later, especially in the world of literature, right? The Piece and Cantos is open to, your thoughts, your interpretations, in addition to whatever Pound may have meant for it to say to his readers. And I thought that was very unique. As well as the languages he switches from, here's a little bit of Mandarin, or here's some Italian, and here's some English, and all these different references kind of tied together in this, swirling book that is the Piece and Cantos, while he was in like a very stressed out emotional state in prison. So it's unique to what it is. And so that's why I was kind of pulled towards it. I did my thesis, my master's thesis on the Pisan Cantos, which I think is how it led to us meeting. Um, so it's been very interesting to share that work because a lot of folks haven't delved into it. They've heard of the Cantos, but not specifically the Pisans. So it's an honor for me to be able to share that research and my thoughts with it with everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah, and to me that indicates that it's a real work of art when it's like really can have effect on the different individuals who encounter it and is open to interpretation in that way. And yeah, I found you online because we had the conference Rewriting the Future. Um, and that was in 2019. Wow, that's 5 years ago already. And we had it at Brunenburg Castle, which was the castle that he lived in after this incarceration with his daughter. And yeah, and we had it there, and I said, well, we have to have someone talking about Pound if we're going to be at his castle. And then I looked up and found this, and I was like, oh my God, this is absolutely perfect for our conference. And I'm so glad that now it's like in book form.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you and Carl both so much for inviting me to the conference and for publishing my little book. Like it's been such an incredible journey since there, and I can't believe it's been 5 years already. That's kind of mind blowing. Um,
Wild.
but I think to sit there and be able to read my little work, in such a, historic place, with, his family there was quite the honor. And being able to walk through the castle and see some of the things on display, it really drove home like how large of a journey and how larger than life he must have been. Just the various artifacts and all of the books, and he just had such a wide variety of interests. And I saw a little bit of that peek through when I was doing my research for the book, and it's just interesting to think how we like to, I think, mentally maybe categorize our favorite authors or writers or artists, maybe like this is who they are. But being in their personal space, their homes, and seeing the different, like the personal touches there, it really makes you think a little bit differently about them. Yes, this was a person, and yes, they might have had wide ranging interests that changed over the years and differing opinions. Pound, especially, I think, is an interesting poet because we have younger Pound, which is contrasted with who he was towards the end of his life after his incarceration and how those experiences changed him. So being in that space and his home was very special to me.
Yeah, it was. And you were on the same panel with his grandson, Siegfried Raschwitz.
Yes. Oh, that was great. He had a great talk. Um,
It was
I
a
did
great
listen to it.
panel.
Yes, it was great. It was wonderful. Oh, it was such a good experience.
Yeah, and I'll link also because I've turned your talk into a podcast previously, like right after the conference. So I'll tell everybody about that as well so they can go and check out the talk and Siegfried's as well.
Awesome. Thank you. That's so cool.
It is cool. I love this. And that was such a magical space. That was such a magical weekend.
Yes. You could just feel it, I don't know. I don't like to say magic in there. I feel like that's a very stereotypical phrase, but that place was very special. Um, yeah, you could just feel like the history and all the stories, like in the space and the walls. It was there. So being there was very it was a very unique, special experience. I don't know. That was so cool. I'm glad that I got to do that.
Me too. Yeah, and Siegfried was such a great guide in telling us about the history of the castle and the area and everything as well, in addition to the talk that he gave. It was really
Mhm.
special and magical. I don't mind saying there's magic in the air. And back to you. Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about what you found through your research? Because it's so interesting. I mean, I had forgotten that Pound worked with Yeats early on, but of course he did, and how influential that was, and how Yeats's kind of occultism influenced it. I feel like part of my work is like so many people know these figures, but their occult interests, especially like people like Yeats, who was like very into the occult, it just gets kind of pushed to the side in like modern like pop culture. People just like focus on writing, but I don't see how you can kind of take the two apart, because it's so important. And people often say if they do acknowledge these things at all, they'll say like, oh, he dabbled in the occult. But people don't
Mm.
generally dabble in the occult. It's kind of like a different worldview when you have a magical worldview. And I feel like that's so like minimizes things so much.
Yeah, I really enjoyed. I had to do some background work with Yeats, of course, before I hopped into Pound when I was writing the book. But he also lived a very interesting life. Um, but I would say, starting with Pound, there's kind of two schools of thought, which I do mention in the book, where there's the initial thought that he first encountered the occult. There was a concert pianist, Heyman, and he was interested in her, and she was interested in the occult, and arguably in like a trendy way, like it was trendy to be, read occult books or what have you at the time in the early 1900s. And so he, of course, kind of like, well, let's have something to talk about perhaps. And so he read some of the things that she was into. And then the second idea is that it really fully, his interest in the occult was blown in with the big storm that is Yeats, and the overpowering figurehead he was for occult study at the time. Now, I would say the thing that was most interesting to me was making the connection between Yeats's occultism and Pound's worldview at the time. He met Yeats in the early 1900s, but pre-World War One, right? World War One was 1914 and 1918. But in 1913, I think everyone is familiar with the poem um, "In a Station of the Metro" with Pound, a very an Imagist poem, pre-modernist. And I feel like it's still probably mentioned in a lot of literature classes in high school. And that's, I think, everyone's first introduction to young Pound. He was like wide-eyed. I want to make a difference in the world of literature. I have skill and I want to share that with everyone. And his way in was to, of course, let's go run with the big players. Who's the big players in the field at the time of, literature and poetry, and who are the movers and shakers? And that, of course, was Yeats and his cohort. So he meets Yeats, and as I go into detail in the book, he does get an invitation, let's say, to be basically Yeats's secretary while Yeats was sequestered at Stone Cottage, which overlaps with World War One timeline wise. Um, did the Pound, because he wanted this idea of exclusivity, like we're special. We're different. He called him and Yeats, he coined the phrase the Order of the Brothers Minor. While they're sequestered away and Yeats was doing his thing and Pound was writing and doing research and assisting. So that's kind of how their relationship developed. But at the time, especially in London, we have the idea that the occult becomes more than just like a trend. It's like a zeitgeist where it just like sweeps all of the parlors and drawing rooms at the time of fashionable people. And let's do seances. Let's speak to the dead. Ooh, magical practice. Let's see what happens. And so it became less of a taboo and more of a trendy thing. Why don't you come over for the weekend? We're going to have a seance. Please come over and we'll have a huge party. So that's the time where Pound was coming up with Yeats. And what Yeats was interested in aside, started to become like mainstream, if you will. And at first, I think we could definitely identify that Pound was not convinced, because Yeats's fairies and folk tales and magical experiments. Pound was like, well, I'm not sure about all that, because he was a very, I feel, a logical person and wasn't necessarily into things that were unseen. And so he, I think, had a difficult time suspending his disbelief, whereas Yeats was fully immersed, um, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, let's do, we're going to do seances here every weekend and we're going to write about it. We're going to research, and we're going to tell everyone about it. Whereas Pound was kind of in the background, be like, this is great. I'm glad that I'm getting to be around all these influential people. But it wasn't necessarily his jam, I guess you could say, the magical
Mm.
part of it. So it was interesting when he began to work with George Mead, and The Quest was a magazine at the time. He started to voluntarily submit items to be published. And so you could kind of see him not necessarily diving right in to, the extent that Yeats was into the magical world and and mysticism, but he was interested in it from a perspective of secret knowledge, exclusivity. Those are things that I want to foster within, my movement or my writing. And so he was drawn to it for, I think, those reasons. And at the time, he was also very influential, and I think, famously, we've all read Ulysses, I think, at some point in our lives. And Pound was an advocate for James Joyce, for his writing to become serialized. That's how he, I guess, became famous, if you could use that phrase back then. He was also an influential voice for T.S. Eliot, Proof Rock, and that was published in Poetry Magazine. So you can see that his friendship and relationship with Yeats and that cohort of the folks that became, willingly or not, the modernist movement, really put them on a worldwide stage. Pound points at someone and it's like, this guy, he has talent. Everyone pay attention. He became an influential figure separate from Yeats on his own. And so I think that sort of sets up the idea of, he had these grand plans of let's write an epic, because he had watched Yeats in various figures. And of course, Ulysses in and of itself is a very large, hefty volume. But Pound wanted to make his own legacy. And so the idea of the cantos came forth, and the cantos were written roughly starting in 1915-ish to 1962 is the finale of the cantos. And of course, the Pisans are right smack in the middle of that timeline. But we kind of see his progression from the earlier cantos. Canto 1 does pick up the story of Ulysses, the mythical figure, and he shows up again in the Pisan cantos. And so we can kind of see, like, loosely woven in throughout the entire cantos, the Pisans, being a little bit more, to me, I think, than some of the other parts, is that he doesn't let go of the idea of the occult, even loosely speaking, and he's interested in myth and mythos and mysticism from canto number 1, starting with Ulysses. We have the gods and goddesses, the fantasy world of, we have Dante and Homer showing up everywhere. And so you can kind of see that he was curious from the beginning. So by the time we get to World War II, of course, we move away from, younger Pound into a different era altogether. And by then, we're talking, years and years after he had first met Yeats. He had moved to Paris. He had become a publisher, an influencer, for lack of a better word, at the time. But in 1939, he was in Italy, and with the advent of World War II, he had all of these ideas about. He was very anti-capitalist government, and so some of the sentiments at the time that now we kind of shy away from talking about, maybe perhaps if we want to draw parallels with occultism, kind of like, do we talk about it? Do we not? I think we've come full circle to those ideas today with both the occult and with the fascist propaganda. So he had, circling back to Pound, he started a radio show for Radio Rome in 1941. So he recorded all these little, basically snippets of radio broadcasts, and he was paid for them. So that was how he was earning an income at the time. But these broadcasts were, for all intents and purposes, anti-American. So his sentiments were, again, anti-capitalism, anti-usury. He was open to the ideals that Mussolini was putting forth. And so those are things that I think today translate to perhaps making folks uncomfortable with diving into other things that Pound may have said, or the opinions that he held at the time. But I think it's important to remember that that shouldn't invalidate the other things that he said throughout his very long career, and the other works that he put forth. So just acknowledging that those are themes that were in his Radio Rome broadcast. The Pisan Cantos specifically, he when he was in prison, so facts wise, Mussolini and his mistress were shot in spring of 1945 and April of 1945. The month right after that, Pound was basically taken into custody as an American traitor, and they put him he made his way through a couple of stops and then ended up in the American Detention Center near Pisa. He was there from May until November. At least several weeks of that internment was outside. And for context, he was in like a small cage outside, and the Pisan plains are known for like high winds, bad weather, and so he was basically put in this cage outside by himself. And because he was a famous figure, people knew who he was. Then of course they were like, well, maybe we shouldn't put him with the rest of the prisoners, and so he was isolated. So the Pisan Cantos really picks up with the time where at first he's okay, he's making do, but eventually he reaches a point, as many of us would, of just like an emotional break. And so we see that happen in the Pisan Cantos, where it starts out as kind of, let me see if I can continue writing the cantos. I'm here, I'm going to work on my epic. And it moves away from that into something very different, where he arguably starts to make his own seance. He falls into the practice of automatic writing, which, as we know, can be used as a tool for therapy to deal with very high stress situations, or let's let out the demons inside, so to speak. And he was really seeking what I see as palingenesis. And palingenesis, of course, is Greek for palin is again, and genesis is birth. And so he was seeking basically the same resolution to his story as Ulysses. He was the hero. He had gone through trials and tribulations. Of course, this was the worst one. I want to be reborn into something different, something new. And so he basically walks us through the different ghosts from his past and the different situations that he's been through. And he mentions in passing, even while he's going through this emotional break, in the Pisan Cantos, he's weaving this story together for us. And of course, falling back to the occult and secret knowledge, unless you know a lot about his life story, or the people that he knew, or the things that he were interested in, it might not make a lot of sense. So he uses it as the ultimate like initiation ritual to, here's what's going on in my head, and it's okay, you don't need to know everything, but this is what it's about. It was very controversial too, that after he was released and so on and so forth, a few years after its publication in 1948, it was actually awarded the Bollingen Prize for poetry. And it was just a scandal, because this man who had been a traitor, in America's eyes, his work was identified as here's the top prize because we thought that what you had to say was valid. And so it's still very interesting to me that despite, even in the late 1940s, after the war had concluded, America was at home trying to return to normal, so to speak. How can we keep our wives at home? They don't need to work anymore. The men are back. How can we get the economy back to normal? Those sorts of things. And Pound, who was the ultimate traitor, one could say, according to some news sources, was awarded a top prize for poetry. So I think that's always a really interesting wrap up to his detention and the fact that his story resonated with so many people, despite his personal political views.
Yeah, and again, that just shows me that that's like a real work of art, processing all of what he's going through in this way. And kind of, it's really like an unfolding of his mind and like a free associative process through the automatic writing. And I remember when you talked at the Brunenberg at the conference, it was like these like ancestors were coming up and these different figures were coming up from his life and his past, and they were kind of present with him, kind of helping him through this time. Yeah, and it's such a fascinating process and so important. I feel like that's the best way to use art, is to help you get through these things and kind of understand your mind and the unfolding of your mind in that way. And of course, it's great that it resonates with people. It's still like this kind of unfolding of a mind, and people can resonate with that in itself, with this like kind of vulnerable process.
Mhm.
Super interesting. I think I'm gonna read this again now. And I've actually I've already read this book twice. And I think I'm gonna read it again now because now I also feel inspired. I'm like, ooh, I want to make an epic poem. And maybe I'll start. And maybe in 50 years I'll have one.
Yeah, I think it's cool. I Before I started, diving into this research, I had never heard of automatic writing before. And so I think learning a little bit about that was just kind of eye-opening. And how it's not something that you have to be interested in the occult or magic or anything like that to try. That just removing, any sort of connotations from automatic writing, that it's used as a therapy tool is really cool. I did a small study when I was writing the book, and I only used 10 people, but I walked them through basically automatic writing as I could understand it from like what Pound may have done, my own unfurls. And so we sat everyone down in separate spaces and just clear your mind, a few deep breaths, and here's 10 minutes. Just sit in, right. Just let your hand right, whatever you're feeling. Don't think anything, please try and keep a blank slate in your mind and let's see what comes up. And the results were wild. I was really inspired by it. One person came up with what was like a little beginning of a story, like a small plot line. And they're like, I have no idea where that came from. Someone else actually drew on the piece of paper, it's just a standard 8.5 by 11 size. It was a whole picture they had drawn, it was like line, like pencil drawing. And the whole sheet was completely full. And so when they came back and they're like, and this is what I had, and they gave the piece of paper to me, it was amazing because they're like, I didn't know I could do that. And it's just it's interesting because if you take some of these ideas and try and filter the Pisan Cantos through it, he's, I think, just perhaps doing the same thing, is using automatic writing in addition to how he understands it as functioning with the occult, bringing back ancestral knowledge or connecting with the spirits or the divine. It's also a tool for him to let out some of the extreme stress that he's under, and maybe let's have purpose to the emotions that we're feeling right now. And so, yeah, automatic writing is really neat. There's an interesting book by Anita Moole on automatic writing, which I highly recommend. But yeah, it's a fascinating practice.
Oh, I'm gonna have to check that out. What's her name again?
Anita Moole, it's Muhl.
Okay, I'm gonna save it right now because otherwise I'll forget, and that way I'll look it up. I love automatic writing and different like yeah, surrealist techniques like exquisite corpse and that kind of thing, and like allowing for this free associative method like in psychoanalysis. I mean, that's really what psychoanalysis people are learning to do, is to kind of allow their mind to unfold more freely without your like neurotic kind of ego trying to like structure things for you, and then you can understand more fully like how your mind is works and how it's connected, and you know how things are kind of coming up for you outside of your like kind of narrow day-to-day view that we have to kind of stay in to do our kind of regular day-to-day lives. It's like a
Yeah, that's
dreamlike
true.
experience in ways.
Mhm. Yeah. I think it's really freeing to let your mind go, you know, because I think we forget how maybe stressed out we are, how many things are on our to-do list, and it's just, you know, it's all in your head, right? But when you purposefully sit back and you're like, "I'm gonna let go, and maybe let's see what comes out," it's the results can be fascinating. And it's just like such a release to do that, especially for folks who are like daily practitioners. It was really interesting. I came across my study, right? A little bit of Yeats. Richard Ellman talks about it a lot in his book, The Man in the Mask, about Yeats, which is really good deep dive into um, Yeats's life and some of the magical practices that he had. But he considered himself to have a primary spirit guide. So when he was doing his automatic writing practices and different magical experiments, he kind of, you know, imagined this. Well, not imagined. He believed that he had a Leo Africanus on his side, his spirit guide. And so it's interesting to see even the contrast between what Yates's spirit guides were telling him and how he's like, yes, these people are guiding me, and I can connect with them, versus Pound's iteration of the same tool, you know, as a more of a way to do, I guess, a form of therapy, or and to
Like
connect with,
processing.
yeah, to connect with his past, but not necessarily in like an occult way. And so it's the same practice, but perhaps two different results and two different intentions between the two men. So that was really interesting to read about. Um,
Yeah, because that's the thing, like, I mean, people don't have to believe like that the ancestors are really there. They could think of it like more psychologically if that's helpful. You know, people can think about these things in different ways, and it can still have a really useful effect. And everybody has these kinds of ancestral influences, whether it's like blood ancestors or just like people who have influenced your development along the way, like different mentors or friends, or especially if you're creative, like a writer or an artist, and you have the artists and writers that influenced you and your work along the way. Those, I always think of those people as like kind of ancestors of sorts, and you know they're like still living in you because they've influenced you and kind of become a part of you in some way.
yeah,
It's
that's so true. Their knowledge lives on. Um, yeah, their influence.
yeah, and
That's
I
such a
like
cool way to think about it.
yeah, and I like doing like William Burroughs, you know, I love the cut up method, and William Burroughs talked about like if you have one of these writers, like if you love Pound or someone else, and you've like read all of their work and you wish that you know, could read more, you can actually like take some of their writing and cut it up and like put it in a box and shake it up and then pull it out, and it's like still their words or like their phrasing that they use, but it's all put together in a new way, and it still kind of like sounds like them because it is them, but it's like them saying new things because it's like making new connections, and it's kind of a way to keep their work going in your own way.
Oh, that's really cool. I wonder what the result of doing that with the Pisan Cantos would be, because it's already like a mishmash, one could say, of different. That would be really cool to
Maybe we
try.
need to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm gonna see, maybe if we have an extra copy around here, I can order like a cheaper copy online or
Yeah.
something, cut it up because yeah, because I bet it would say some really interesting stuff, especially because it's like already free associative. The cut up process is kind of similar in that like free associative way because things come together and it seems like random, but then I don't know if it's our mind that like makes the meaning, you know, and it's like I don't know. I just love it.
Yeah. That's so interesting because you would never get the same message twice. It would be impossible. Oh, that's so cool. Yeah.
Exactly. And I tend to like paste down my cutouts, but like I have like an artist friend like named Joan Pope who like when she does things, like she'll cut up pieces that she wants to use in her collages and then she'll photograph them when she's laid it out and like make it digital and then use the print as the image that she displays. And that way she still has the elements and can put them back in the box and use them again in the future, which I
Oh,
think is also a really cool idea.
yeah. Oh, that's really neat. Yeah,
I'm
that's
gonna have to have
awesome.
her on too and talk about it. Okay, so now I'm inspired to make my own epic poem and to do cut-ups with poetry, specifically the Pisan Cantos. I remember you also talking about, like you mentioned before, like how he had all these different languages. Like all of a sudden there'd be like Chinese characters and things. Will you talk a little about that and like why does he know Chinese? Like what was that influence about?
He, well, in his younger years, he went through an Ernest Fenollosa phase. So Fenollosa was an American Orientalist and educator who made a significant contribution to the preservation of traditional art in Japan. But Pound was interested in it because he had they called it the No mask, and it's NOH, which you can Google. There's lots of examples online. But it was basically a traditional uh, mask making method, which of course held a lot of meaning. And so Fenollosa at the time basically just documented here's what the No masks are, how they're used in performance, and how they're interpreted, and the different masks mean various things, right? And there's, you could say, hundreds of iterations of the no mask. And Pound went through, I guess you could say, a phase of being very interested in Orientalism, as it was called at the time. So we have, influences from Chinese, Japanese, and various artistic expressions. And so he wanted to, as a part of his intention to make an epic poem, he wanted to pull in the ideas that there are cultural references that are outside of what we would consider the norm. So he was very much into, here's a thing that I learned about. Again, remember that he was into exclusive knowledge. This is something that perhaps I know, and I'm going to share with everyone else. And so he was inspired by Fenollosa's work. And so he weaves through references to different stories from the No masks, and that those cultural references, those folk tales, if you will, into his cantos. And they do show up in the Pisan Cantos as well. So we have different Chinese characters. And so he switches from Italian, a passage in Italian, to a few lines later, we have some Chinese characters or Mandarin show up. And it's just like he understands what he's trying to say, even though you or I may not speak either one of those languages, and we only speak English. So something in the text of what he says on that page we'll be able to read, just not the whole thing, right? So which would take you back to he wanted to, if nothing else, educate other people, and that's a running theme that we can see throughout his work, from finding and helping young authors get published, those who he thought could be influential, whether it be with art or with the vorticism movement when we had that, or let's there's a phrase that I think Longenbach uses in his book, about Yeats and Pound's time together at Stonehenge, where he's like, Pound is pulling everyone into the next century with him, because he felt like that in his younger years, poetry was outdated. It was Victorian, it wasn't trendy, and he thought that interest in it was fading. And so in his idea that writing his epic poem, let's include as much culture as we can. Let me educate people on things that they've maybe never heard about before, or maybe they don't know how to read, and I'm going to put it in my work, and you're going to be curious and you're going to go find out about it, and it will have come from me, right? I'm the teacher, I'm the purveyor of wisdom. And we, even in his mental state being what it was during his imprisonment, he still does that in the Pisan Cantos. And so the notes, the appendix is huge in the Pisan Cantos, because there's hundreds of references to things that perhaps you or I just aren't offhand familiar with, and languages being one of those things. And so that's the fascinating thing as well, that his mind worked in between those different languages, where here's one phrase and this is my intention, and he carries it through three different languages in a single passage. to make his ultimate point. And I think that's something that he perhaps put on fast forward in the Pisan Cantos. We do see that throughout the cantos as a whole, where he kind of switches back and forth between subjects sometimes, or it's a an amalgamation of a few different things in the same passage, and it might seem confusing. But the Pisan Cantos, he's really like, okay, this is my last chance to impart any wisdom, anything I want to leave with. This is my legacy, the last thing I might write. What do I have to say? And he just lets it go. You know, so I do think that part of the mishmash of subject matter, the different languages, I do think part of that was purposeful. I do think also a lot of it was through the automatic writing that I believe he conducted for the Pisan Cantos, because it's just such an interesting idea of even sometimes warring ideas within the same canto, that you're like, well, I don't know how to interpret all of this. And it's okay. He's not asking you to come to a conclusion. He's just asking you to witness this with him. So I think that's a very interesting thing. And it's definitely open to interpretation, because what I see in it might be something totally different than what you or someone else reads on the page. And I think to him, that would have been an ultimate success to both, boggle some minds, but also be like, yes, this man had a lot of knowledge and a lot of things to teach the world, which I think is very evident in the Pisan Cantos specifically.
Yeah, and that makes sense too. I mean, that's how the unconscious is. Like there are contradicting elements that are there at the same time, and that's just how people are. And so if he's writing in this associative way, and like, and then he probably has these connections between the different languages, where one reminds him of another phrase in another, and kind of jumps around in that way. If he knows these different languages and their symbolism, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Super interesting. Well, I'm so excited, and I'm so excited that we get to talk again soon because we're doing the event at Morbid Anatomy.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm very excited about that. It'll be also interesting to hear Mike talk as well. I'm definitely gonna pick that up and see what I can read from him. That's cool. Cool subject matter.
Yeah, we sent Mitch your book as well, so he has it. So he's gonna have looked at it too.
Yay. Okay,
So
well
you
then
will
the
be
pressure's
familiar.
on. Yeah. No, well then I'll give him a read. That's so cool. I'm glad that you're pairing us, because that seems like that's a cool juxtaposition. Also similarities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I think you'll like his book, Modern Occultism, because it is also it goes through like occultism from Greek until now, but it's really nice to get this kind of historical timeline of how things unfolded and influenced one another over time. And it's also been really interesting to hear more about Pound's history, like you've explained, because it puts a lot of what you talk about in the book into kind of context of his life even more.
Mhm. Yeah, that'll be really neat to hear, because I think it's even just my touching on some of the Greek history and trying to identify, just even I was trying to just focus on Ulysses and Odysseus. That's a very like tiny portion of probably what Mitch knows. But there's such a vast amount of research and information to put together to even get like a cohesive timeline for where we get some of these stories. Or even I love the debates, right, where they're like, well, we've heard about this story first here, but no, 50 years later it came from somewhere completely different. So that'll be interesting to hear him talk about. But that was a challenge for putting together my book. It's just that there's so much information, and you could just do a deep dive on Pound and the Greeks. That could probably result in volumes of study, if anything, because he was nothing if not fascinated by a good mythical tale.
That's good. That's wonderful. I think I interviewed a couple of Jungian psychoanalysts recently just to find out in academia, like Jungians are so split off from like Freudians and Lacanians and others. The Jungians kind of have their own schools and things like that that are outside of
Mhm.
like, standard academic discourse. And it was so interesting to hear them talk about their training more because they talked about how a lot of it they go into mythology and folk tales and things like that because I agree you can learn so much about the human mind and experience through looking at mythology and folklore.
Yeah, I really did enjoy that part of when I was doing my thesis, right? Is reading how like Yeats as a young man was exposed to all those folk tales and the fairy tale stories and things like that in Ireland, and how he basically takes those ideas and they stay with him. So even when he meets Pound later, he's still like trying to investigate some of those stories from his youth and where did those come from, and what magic is underlying those tales, and can I find it? That's really fascinating to think about, and like all of the magical experiments that he conducted, even if some of them had a very high failing rate, he was curious, and I think that I really enjoyed reading that part of Yates plus Pound. Is just how curious Yates was at the time, and he was like undeterred by anybody's criticism, or gosh, that's not going to work. He's like, that's fine, I'm going to try anyway. And Pound was over here, I imagine, as sort of maybe a slight curmudgeon. You're like, well, maybe you've tried something like this before, but he wanted to see how it unfolded, and so I think he was like grudgingly curious about some of those folk tales and some of that magical lore uh, that surrounded Yeats. So that was a really interesting part of my study.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so rich. Well, thank you so much, Katrina. Everybody should get your book, Invoking the Spirits, the Occult Influences in Ezra Pound's Pisan Cantos. It's such a great little book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And I look forward to seeing you in about a month at More of an Anatomy.
Yes,
And
sounds
this,
good. I'm excited. All right. Oh, that sounds awesome. Thank you so much.
you're welcome. Bye, Katrina.
Bye.